Hi everyone, it's Thorn. Welcome to my YouTube channel. If you like what you see, or if you feel strongly enough about it that it exists at all, whether or not you like it, please consider subscribing, and find me on Instagram at ThornTheWitch. So, this video, I wanted to address something that shows up in my comments with some regularity and something that shows up in my inbox with some regularity, and I don't really know how controversial this is. I think probably as an insider, I don't have a great sense of how controversial this is, but I wanted to talk about it just because it's not something I've touched on in my channel before. Despite the title of the video, I'm really not going to get down into the history of Wicca. There are much more qualified people to do so who have done so. So I'd really advise that folks check out some of the contemporary scholarship on the subject rather than just, you know, cruising around the internet. Yields some answers that are not always super awesome. So I just kind of wanted to share some of my thoughts as an insider within the Gardnerian tradition, as somebody who's kind of, you know, it just like in the midst of things, right? And this is a critique that shows up all the time, and it's usually directed with some level of hostility rather than, I think, genuine curiosity. Although I think since the critique has been circulated so much in kind of like mainstream pagan media and witchcraft media, I think increasingly people aren't real sure about the veracity of the claim. So just touching on it. Was Gerald Gardner a fraud? Is all of this made up? Was Gerald Gardner just some messed up naked dude out in the woods out there to deceive people into believing his elaborately concocted lie? And there's a couple of things happening here. I think there's two questions we have to ask, rather. Was he a fraud? Which, of course, first we have to talk about what it means to be a fraud. And then second, does it matter? What is the impact that him being a fraud or not being a fraud has on contemporary Wiccan practice today? I think that second question is much more interesting. You know, there's a lot of debate about whether or not we can take somebody's creation and kind of separate out the creator. Right? Like this is very like Roland Barthes, death of the author type stuff. Like, can we appreciate Harry Potter if J.K. Rowling is a transphobe? Can we appreciate, again, like Wicca? If Gerald Gardner is this terrible person, then what do we do with Wiccans and Wicca today? Not to compare those two things, okay? But I think they happen with the same language, and these are concerns that people have because of, I think, shared reasons. So, not being a historian, as a lot of, I think, contemporary Gardnerians today, I've read Ronald Hutton, right? I've read Gerald Gardner. I've read most of the contemporary scholarship about contemporary witchcraft and Wicca available today. And the general consensus, kind of my impression, is that we're all pretty much in agreement, right? We're all in agreement that there is no ancient witch cult, right? Wicca is not an ancient religion. It's a contemporary religion. I don't know a single Gardnerian who doesn't know this and doesn't adhere to this. Not off of the internet anyway. I think that this is an established reality for people today. It's been a good long while since I've met anybody who claimed that Wicca was ancient, and overwhelmingly those folks are from much older generations than my own. So you got to remember too, like a lot of the scholarship is relatively recent. I mean, Hutton doesn't come out with Triumph of the Moon until it's like 1998. So a lot of us were pretty well entrenched in our Scott Cunninghams at that point. You know, looking at ancient cave paintings and making this the god of the hunt, god of the witches, tra-la-la. All of that stuff was very common. You know, I was a teen at that point, but I saw it into the first couple of years of the 2000s, but I really think that Triumph of the Moon blew most of that stuff apart. I am of the mindset that Gardner believed what he was teaching. Just reading his work and reading accounts of him from people who knew him, and, you know, like, maybe this is wishful thinking, but I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. I think that he believed that his tradition was ancient. I think he was probably initiated into something. I don't know, okay? I'm not saying it was an ancient witch cult, okay? But I think that whatever ritual experience he underwent was emotionally and spiritually important for him, and I think he believed in it. Whether or not it was historically true, and Gardner wasn't a historian, right? So, I mean, he thought of himself as an anthropologist, right? But, like, no. I think that he sincerely believed what he was doing. I don't think that he was sitting at home, like, consciously, like, wheedling his thumbs together like Mr. Burns, you know, over, like, having hoodwinked a bunch of people. And that's the language that shows up online. I think when we use the word fraud, it implies that somebody is consciously doing something in order to deceive other people. And I think that Gardner was in love with a fantasy. I also think that it is unfair to target Gardner specifically when this is something that basically everybody writing at that time was also guilty of. I don't know how we could call Gardner a fraud without also calling Cochrane a fraud, or Alex Sanders a fraud, or Dorian Valiente a fraud. Like, the list could just kind of go on. And I'm not comfortable doing any of that. I think that people genuinely believed what they were teaching. These were the histories they believed. And I think that they thought what they were doing was rooted in ancient practice. And then even, like, after Hutton, I know in some of Raven Grimassi's later books, he talks a lot about the concept of spiritual history. This idea that something might not be literally true or historical, but it still has emotional, spiritual weight. There's this idea of a spiritual lineage. I don't know how I feel about that language, but I am on board with that emotionally, just because I see that as what's playing out when I go back and I read some of these founders of contemporary witchcraft. I don't think that, for the most part, at least the ones who are most popularly cited, I don't think that for the most part people were out there willingly deceiving folks. I mean, there are obviously some bogus initiation stories, right? There's lots of magic grandmas floating around, and I think that stuff was deliberately contrived. Not necessarily to, like, hoodwink people, but I think because that's how authenticity and authority was established at that point. And today, like, people still make up origin stories. And I mean, you know, Gardner didn't give us a magic grandma story, so that was something at least. But I believe that the feeling behind what he was doing was sincere, and I think that he believed it. I think that it's unfair to say that he was just a fraud, so we need to throw Wicca out. And that's the kind of, like, meme, like, the meme culture, I think, that's alive today. Like, if something isn't historically authentic, then it must be trash. Like, we say we're over that idea, but we're really not. Like, we're still pretty into this idea that the older something is, the more authoritative it is. And if Wicca is a contemporary religion, and again, like, Wiccans know it's a contemporary religion. Like, who's out there writing about Wicca saying it's not a contemporary religion? Like, even if that's the case, that doesn't diminish the value that it has for practitioners today. So that's kind of the first piece. The second piece, which I just touched on, is, do we care? Does it matter? Okay, if Gardner's a fraud, let's say he knowingly made everything up. He didn't believe any of it. He was just trying to get some naked babes around him. Okay, which is, like, what people say. That's so weird. But if that's the case, then what do we do as contemporary Wiccans? And, you know, the religion isn't hinged on Gerald Gardner, so the answer is that it doesn't matter. We do nothing. Because, nothing about the tradition is centered on the putting Gardner on a pedestal. I think people still have this idea that Wiccans worship Gerald Gardner somehow, like we're sitting there with Gerald Gardner, like Meaning of Witchcraft or Witchcraft Today or the Ardanes or something, and we're poring over them, and like this is our law, and you know, if Gardner didn't write it somewhere, it must not be part of the tradition. And again, like, I don't know any Wiccans who are like that. Like, that's certainly not how I was brought up. And I think that's just a stereotype that people who don't like Wiccans circulate. And that's something that's frequently flung against us. Like, Wicca is stupid because all of us are just obsessed with Gerald Gardner, and it's this made-up religion, and like we don't let anybody else in unless they love Gerald Gardner, and like that, none of that stuff just isn't true. If you think about how many people were involved in the establishment of Wicca, as though it was ever just Gardner, right? And also how little time a lot of those people spent with Gardner in the long run. Like we point to Doreen Valiente as the mother of Wicca, right? But it's not like she spent her whole life with Gardner. Like, it was really just a matter of a few years. And then she went off and did other things, okay? All of them witchcraft. And she built this into her own personal practice, right? This kind of like cohesive thing that worked for her and that she wrote about. And I don't know, I think people think of Wicca as being this monolithic thing that's just sort of spouted by one person, and Wiccans just worship those ideas and that's it. And I don't know where, I mean, historically, like those were critiques that were levied at Gardner pretty much from the beginning, particularly by other kinds of witches. So that kind of critique didn't even just originate with like internet meme culture, right? It's been around since Gardner's been around. Anyway, that's kind of it. I think people put too much weight on Gerald Gardner, particularly people outside of the Gardnerian tradition, which I think is really funny. And I think a lot of it just comes from a misunderstanding of how Wiccan groups operate, how Wiccan lineage is passed, how people come into the tradition, how they practice it in their personal lives. I think people just don't have a good sense of what that looks like. By the way, I wrote a whole book about it, so if you're curious, Traditional Wicca, A Seeker's Guide, will tell you all of those things. Anyway, just some thoughts. I don't really advise people to necessarily read Gardner, except as a means of achieving cultural literacy in witchcraft spaces. I think it's important to know Gardner's work. I think if you're serious about studying witchcraft, then Gardner should be on your list, but I would never recommend Gardner to actually learn witchcraft. So if you are going to read Gardner, I'd really recommend The Meaning of Witchcraft over Witchcraft Today, just because I think it's it's more comprehensive, and I think it's easier to read. So a piece of advice, but I'd really recommend that folks look at the founders, not just Gardner, but like go out there, like go read Cochrane's letters, and go read Maxine Sanders, and go read the folks who are writing, Stuart Farrar, and read Gardner, like read Valiente, read these folks instead of just circulating memes about them, and making sweeping statements about what sort of people they were or are. Anyway, I hope you all are well, and that you're having a nice weekend.